Some people arrive in a place and think owning land means owning its history. They're always wrong, and they always find out the hard way. My grandfather built that road with his own two hands in 1959. No crew, no contractor, just a borrowed gravel spreader, and 3 weekends of October cold. He hauled crushed limestone himself, carved a path through the eastern edge of his land, and never once complained. My father watched it happen, 5 years old, standing on the porch, not understanding what he was building, but knowing it mattered. It mattered for 65 years. We called it the back road, not because it was special to anyone else, but because it was everything to us. It wasn't paved, wasn't pretty, wasn't even on a map, but it was ours. He drove it for 40 years. My father drove it, I drove it, and now my kids do too. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, a woman who had lived in our county for exactly 11 months decided it belonged to her. Her name was Brenda Calloway, newly elected president of the Millbrook Estates HOA, a subdivision carved out of land that used to belong to people who understood boundaries. She carried those bylaws like they were sacred law, and walked our property like she already owned it. She had no idea that our family had been fighting bigger battles than her long before she was born. She had no idea what those green ledger books in my safe contained. She had no idea that a handshake in 1958 still carried more weight than her printed bylaws ever would. And she had absolutely no idea what she had just started. It arrived on a Wednesday, tucked between a seed catalog and the electric bill, a crisp white envelope with the Millbrook Estates HOA logo embossed in gold on the upper left corner. My wife, Donna, set it on the kitchen counter without a word and watched me open it. She'd seen enough county tax notices and equipment lender letters over the years to know that official envelopes on a Wednesday afternoon were rarely good news. The letter informed us, formally, with footnotes, that the gravel road running along the eastern edge of our property had been identified as an encroachment upon HOA common grounds, and that we were hereby required to cease use of said road within 30 days or face legal action. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the counter and poured myself a cup of coffee. The coffee was already cold. I drank it anyway. "Well?" Donna said. "She's wrong," I said. "How wrong?" I took a sip. 30 years of wrong. That road had been in continuous use by our family since my grandfather cut it in 1959. We used it to move equipment between the south field and the barn, to haul hay, to get the tractor out to the back acreage during wet season when the main drive turned to mud. It wasn't just convenient, it was essential. Without it, we'd have to drive 2 miles around on County Road just to get to our own land, adding 40 minutes to a workday that already started before sunrise and rarely ended before dark. In hay season, when the weather window was narrow and every hour counted, that road was the difference between a saved crop and a ruined one. I thought about my grandfather building it, and I thought about what he would have said. If he'd gotten this letter, probably nothing. He'd have poured his own coffee, read it again, and gone back to work. But there would have been something in his eyes. A quiet settling, the way a man looks when he's decided something that doesn't need to be said out loud. I dug out the deed that evening. Then I called our attorney, Carl Briggs, who had handled my father's estate and who had grown up 3 farms over from us. He listened to me read the letter aloud without interrupting. I could hear him breathing steadily on the other end of the line, the way a doctor listens when he already has a diagnosis. "She bought that parcel from the Hendersons?" he asked. "The HOA did, about a year ago. And she's claiming the road is on HOA ground?" "That's what the letter says." There was a pause. I heard him shift in his chair. "Pull your grandfather's original survey, the one from '58. I'll need to see it before I tell you anything for certain. But I have a feeling Miss Calloway is about to learn something about prescriptive easements." I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the wind move through the fields and thought about the letter sitting on the kitchen counter. Donna asked me at some point if I was worried. I told her no. She said she believed me and went back to sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling. It wasn't worry keeping me awake. It was something closer to readiness. The kind of stillness that comes not from uncertainty, but from knowing exactly what you're about to do. The road had been there before Brenda Calloway's subdivision existed, would be there after. The only question was how long it was going to take to remind her of that. I'd met Brenda exactly once before the letter arrived at the Millbrook County Fair in September. She'd been manning a booth for the HOA, handing out pamphlets about community beautification standards to people who mostly just wanted to get to the funnel cake stand. She was in her late 50s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of precise posture that told you she'd spent a lot of years in corporate conference rooms. She had well-maintained nails, and a smile that engaged and disengaged with the practiced efficiency of a light switch. She handed me a pamphlet. I thanked her and didn't read it. I later found out she'd retired early from a property management company in Atlanta and moved up here with her husband, Gerald, who mostly stayed home and watched golf. Brenda had thrown herself into the HOA with the energy of someone who needed a project. Not an idle project, a meaningful one. She wanted to build something, or at least organize something, and the Millbrook Estates HOA gave her a platform and a gavel and 47 homeowners who were mostly too busy or too polite to tell her to slow down. Within 6 months of moving in, she'd overhauled the bylaws, instituted new lawn care requirements, and sent 14 formal complaint letters to residents, 7 of which were about holiday lighting, 3 about fences, and 2 about a particular shade of exterior paint she described in one letter as jarring to community aesthetics. Within 9 months, she'd run for HOA president unopposed because nobody else wanted the job badly enough to deal with her. She was not a bad person, exactly. That's important to say because it would be easy to make her the villain of this story. And she wasn't. She was the kind of person who confused order with righteousness, who believed that if you found the right rule and applied it firmly enough, the world would behave the way it should. In Atlanta, managing commercial properties, that instinct had probably served her well. Rules were rules. Leases were leases. The paperwork said what it said. What she hadn't accounted for was that she'd moved somewhere where some of the most important agreements were 65 years old and signed in a farmhouse kitchen over a glass of sweet tea. She'd moved to a place where the land remembered things the title search hadn't caught. I drove past the subdivision on my way into town that Thursday and saw her out by the entrance sign, supervising the planting of new hedges. She had on a coral-colored fleece. Beston was pointing at something with a clipboard. She saw my truck and waved at me the way you wave at someone you've already beaten, small and certain. A wave that said, "I've already handled this." I waved back. I could afford to be patient. Carl had called that morning. He'd found what he was looking for. My grandfather, Elias Cord, had been a meticulous man. He kept records the way some people keep faith, absolutely and without exception. He distrusted banks until he was 53 years old, but he never distrusted documentation. Every purchase, receipt, every repair bill, every boundary conversation with a neighbor was recorded in a series of green hardcover ledger books with his name written inside the front cover in his deliberate, old-fashioned cursive, Elias James Cord, Cord Farm, Millbrook County. Those ledger books now lived in a fireproof safe in my office, along with a collection of surveys, deeds, and agreements that my father had spent the last decade of his life organizing into Manila. Folders labeled in his own handwriting. Dad was a quieter man than his father, less likely to talk, more likely to document. Between the two of them, our family had produced a paper trail that a law school could have used as a case study. The original property survey from 1958, conducted by a licensed surveyor named Walter Pruitt, showed not only the boundaries of our land, but a hand-annotated note in the margin that read, RD Road Access Strip, Eastern Edge, to remain in continuous family use per verbal agreement with adjacent landowner R. Henderson, confirmed in writing September 14, 1958. Walter Pruitt had been the kind of surveyor who understood that his job was to record not just lines but agreements. He'd drawn the road right onto the map with a dotted line and a note. You could see it clearly, even after 65 years, the dotted line running along the eastern fence. The margin annotation in pencil, still dark and legible because the paper had been kept dry and protected. The written confirmation, it turned out, was also in the safe. A one-page document, hand-typed on a manual typewriter, signed by both my grandfather and Robert Henderson, Brenda's predecessor's predecessor, acknowledging the road as a permanent access route for the Cord family property. There were two signatures at the bottom. My grandfather's was bold and angled. Henderson's was smaller, more careful. Two men shaking hands across a property line, believing their word was enough, and putting it in writing anyway, just to be certain. Carl was almost gleeful when I brought it in. He spread the documents across his desk, the way a card player lays down a winning hand, deliberately, with pleasure. "This is better than I expected," he said. "You've got the original survey, the written agreement, and 65 years of continuous, documented use. In this state, that's a textbook prescriptive easement. Possibly even a deeded one, depending on how a judge reads this Henderson agreement. So she can't touch the road. She can try, but she'd lose." He looked up at me over his reading glasses. "The question is how you want to play this. I can send her a letter, or we can let her file first and answer in court." I thought about my grandfather, about the mornings I'd ridden beside my father in the truck cab, half asleep at 5 in the morning, watching the gravel kick up under the headlights and the fog lying low over the south field. About my own kids doing the same thing, fighting to stay awake on the way out to check the cabs, learning without realizing they were learning what it meant to work land that belonged to your family. "Send the letter," I said, "but make it thorough." Carl smiled the way a man smiles when he's been waiting for an excuse to do something right. "I was hoping you'd say that." Carl's letter went out on a Friday. It was 8 pages long, single-spaced, with 4 exhibits attached: the 1958 survey, the Henderson agreement, a timeline of continuous road use compiled from my grandfather's ledger books, and a 2-page summary of prescriptive easement law in our state. Carl had written it with the thoroughness of someone who expected it to be read by a judge, which was, of course, the point. By Monday morning, Brenda had hired an attorney of her own, a young man named Preston Alt from a firm in the city who specialized in HOA law and had a headshot on his website where he was smiling like he'd just won something. He probably had. HOA law in a growing suburban county was a growth industry. There were a lot of people like Brenda out there, and a lot of old properties like ours that newer developments were pressing up against. His response letter arrived 9 days later. It was 14 pages long. It questioned the validity of the 1958 survey on the grounds that Walter Pruitt's license had lapsed 2 years after the survey was conducted, a detail that sounded dramatic and turned out to be, legally, irrelevant, since the survey had been conducted while the license was active. It challenged the legal standing of the Henderson agreement on the grounds that it had never been formally recorded with the county. And it introduced a counter-argument that any prescriptive easement claim would require proof of hostile use, meaning use without the owner's permission, which, they argued, a friendly family agreement could not constitute. It was well constructed, I'll give Preston Alt that. He'd done his homework and found every weak joint in our argument and pressed on them. That's what you hire an attorney to do. I didn't hold it against him, but I also noticed on page 11 a sentence that made my stomach tighten for the first time since this started. Our client additionally notes that the access road in question crosses a drainage easement filed with Millbrook County in 2019, and any continued use may constitute interference with county infrastructure. That was new. That was Brenda being smarter than I'd given her credit for. She'd done her own research, or Preston Alt had done it for her, and they'd found a filing I hadn't thought to look for. The drainage easement was newer than the subdivision itself. It had been filed as part of the county's stormwater management expansion. If the road crossed a county drainage corridor, that was a second front in a fight I'd been thinking of as one-dimensional. I called Carl. He'd already read it. "The drainage easement is real," he said, "but it doesn't prohibit surface use. They're stretching." "She's going to the county," I said. "Probably already has." Sure enough, 2 days later I got a call from the county planning office. A courtesy notice that a complaint had been filed regarding unpermitted use of a county drainage corridor. Nothing formal yet. Just a heads up that an inquiry had been opened. The woman on the phone was apologetic in the way people in government offices are apologetic when they're doing something they find slightly embarrassing. "We have to follow up on all complaints," she said. I told her I understood completely. Brenda was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously: the HOA legal challenge, the county inquiry, and the pressure of simply making the dispute public and complicated enough that we'd consider settling. I had to respect the strategy, even as I prepared to dismantle it piece by piece. That weekend, my brother Dale drove up from Savannah. He was a civil engineer who'd spent 12 years working for a county infrastructure department before going into private consulting. He understood drainage systems the way I understood planting schedules. I walked him down the road on a Saturday morning, and he crouched at the drainage culvert where it crossed under our path. Spent 20 minutes taking measurements and photographs, and stood up brushing clay off his knees, with the satisfied look of a man who has confirmed what he already suspected. "She's got nothing," he said. "This culvert is a passive system. No active flow control, no mechanical components, no erosion indicators from surface traffic. Your road doesn't interfere with it in any documentable way. I can write that up as a professional engineering assessment if you need it." "I need it," I said. He clapped me on the shoulder. We stood there for a moment looking down the gravel road, the November fields bare and brown on both sides of us. "You know, Granddad would have loved this," he said. "He would have settled it with a fence post and a hard stare." Dale laughed. "We've evolved." We walked back up the road together, and I made coffee, and we spent the afternoon going over Deowa's notes at the kitchen table while the wind picked up outside and Donna brought us sandwiches and didn't say much, which is what she does when she's confident things are going to work out. Brenda made her first real mistake in October when she brought the road dispute to the monthly HOA meeting. I wasn't a member of the HOA. I had no standing to attend. My land wasn't part of the development and never had been. But 3 of my neighbors were members: Jim Acosta, who ran a small cattle operation south of us and had been a member since the subdivision formed, largely because he believed in knowing what was being decided; Patty Wellborn, whose family had been in the county longer than mine and who attended the meetings with the quiet attentiveness of someone taking notes for a history she intended to write someday; and old Roy Finch, who was 81 years old and had watched every development in Millbrook County for 6 decades and attended the meetings, specifically because he felt someone with memory ought to be in the room. Patty called me the morning after the meeting. She had the careful, organized way of recounting things of someone who had paid close attention and wanted to get it exactly right. "She made a presentation," Patty said, "slides and everything, called your road an uncontrolled access point and said it was a security and liability concern for the whole development. She had a map blown up on a poster board with the road drawn in red." What did the room think? Half of them had no idea what she was talking about. The other half were uncomfortable. Your family's been here forever, and people know that. A few of them looked like they wanted to be somewhere else. She paused, but she got a vote passed. OA is officially backing her legal position. That's her right. She also said, Patty hesitated in a way that told me the next part was going to bother me. She said your family had been taking advantage of a paperwork gap for decades, and that it was time the community formalized the land situation. I was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, I could see the south field and the beginning of the gravel road at the edge of our property. My grandfather's road. A paperwork gap, I said. Yeah. Roy Finch stood up, Patty added, and I could hear the smile in her voice before she even said the next part. He stood right up and told her he remembered when this whole development was a soybean field, and that some paperwork gaps were older than her house and her career combined. He said it very politely. He said it with his hands folded in his lap. The whole room went quiet. I laughed despite myself. Roy Finch was the kind of man who could deliver a devastating observation in the tone of someone remarking on the weather. He'd been doing it for 6 decades. It never got less effective. She didn't like that, Patty said. I imagine not. But Roy's comment had given me something more than a laugh. It had given me a direction. If Brenda wanted to talk about history and formalization and what the paperwork said, we could talk about history. We could talk about history in a way that she had not anticipated, because she had only looked at the title when the HOA bought the land, and she'd trusted that the title was clean, and she'd been wrong. I made some calls that afternoon, and by the end of the week I had something better than a legal argument. I had a story that the records would tell for themselves. The Millbrook County Recorder's office was a quiet place. 2 rooms, fluorescent lights, the smell of old paper and industrial carpet, and a woman named Agnes who had worked there for 30 years and knew where everything was without looking. She moved through the filing cabinets the way farmers move through their own land, without hesitation, or without need of a map, by memory that had become indistinguishable from instinct. I spent a Tuesday afternoon there with Carl, pulling the chain of title for every parcel that touched the eastern edge of our farm, going back to the original land grant in 1887. Agnes helped us without being asked. She seemed to find the exercise interesting, or maybe she just appreciated people who came in with a clear purpose and good questions. What we found was more than we'd hoped for. More, in fact, than I had dared to expect, even after Carl's initial optimism. The Henderson family, who had sold to the developer who had sold to the HOA, had recorded a deed restriction in 1961, just 3 years after my grandfather's handshake agreement with Robert Henderson. That restriction, buried in the chain of title and apparently overlooked in the title search when the HOA purchased the land, stated explicitly, the eastern access corridor of this parcel shall remain unobstructed for agricultural use by adjacent property owners in perpetuity, as condition of original sale in perpetuity. 2 words, written in 1961 by Robert Henderson's attorney, recorded with the county on a Tuesday morning 63 years ago, sitting undisturbed in the deed records ever since. Not hiding, just quiet. Waiting. The way documents wait when no one has needed them yet. Agnes found it in 11 minutes. She'd seen it before, she said, years ago. When someone else had asked about that parcel, she didn't remember who or why. She hadn't thought it would matter to anyone. Now it mattered to everything. Carl read the document 3 times in the parking lot afterward, standing in the October wind with his coat open, not seeming to notice the cold. I waited. A mockingbird was going through its repertoire in a sweet gum tree at the edge of the lot. Carl read the document a 4th time. This isn't just a prescriptive easement argument anymore, he finally said. This is a recorded deed restriction that runs with the land. It doesn't matter who owns that parcel or who buys it or what they intend to do with it. The restriction travels with the title. The HOA bought property that was already legally obligated to preserve your road access. He looked up at me. Their own title search should have caught this. So the title company missed it. Their title insurance company is about to have a very bad week, Carl said. This is exactly the kind of thing title insurance exists to protect against. Brenda's HOA may have a claim against their own insurance. He paused, which is their problem, not ours. We filed our formal response to the county inquiry the following morning, attaching Dale's engineering assessment. The response was measured and complete. Carl sent a supplemental letter to Preston Alt the same day, a short one this time, with a copy of the 1961 deed restriction printed on a single page and highlighted in yellow. Preston Alt called Carl 2 hours later. Carl told me about it that evening over the phone. He said Alt had sounded considerably less cheerful than his website photo suggested. He had asked for 2 weeks to review the new documentation. Carl had said that was fine. We had all the time in the world. Because the road was going nowhere, it never had been. We just needed the paperwork to say what the land had always known. The HOA dropped the legal action on a Thursday, 16 weeks after Brenda's first letter arrived in our mailbox between a seed catalog and an electric bill. Preston Alt filed a notice of withdrawal with the county. The planning office closed their inquiry. The drainage corridor complaint was formally marked unsubstantiated and filed away. Dale's engineering assessment was entered into the county record and then, like so many documents that were never needed again, forgotten. Carl called me when the paperwork came through. He said it simply. It's done. They're not appealing. He didn't editorialize. He was a man who understood that some victories didn't need commentary. I thanked him and walked outside. It was a cold morning, clear and bright, the kind of November day that makes the fields look like something painted rather than grown. The sky was a hard, pale blue. The air smelled of turned earth and wood smoke from somewhere up the road. I walked down the drive and turned onto the gravel road, my grandfather's road, and walked it from one end to the other. Half a mile. The gravel and clay had frozen slightly overnight and crunched under my boots. I walked it slowly, the way you walk a thing you've nearly lost. I thought about Elias's cord loading his flatbed in the October cold of 1959, his 5-year-old son watching from the porch. I thought about my father driving this road in the dark before dawn, the truck's headlights cutting through the fog over the south field, me half asleep against the passenger door. I thought about my own children doing the same thing, sitting beside me over the years, learning the land the way children learn language, by immersion, without knowing it's happening. You spend enough mornings on a road and it becomes part of how you understand the world. That's what Brenda Calloway hadn't understood. You can't read that in a bylaw. Brenda sent a letter 2 weeks later, not through her attorney. Her own stationery, her own handwriting, delivered in a plain envelope with a first-class stamp. It was brief, 3 paragraphs. She said she had been operating under the assumption that the HOA's property purchase had been conducted with a clean title, and that she had not been aware of the 1961 deed restriction. She said she understood now that the road had a documented legal history that predated the subdivision by decades. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. I sat with the letter for a day before I wrote back. I wanted to make sure I said what I actually meant, not what I was tempted to say in the first few minutes after reading it. I wrote back and told her there were no hard feelings. I meant it. I really did. She wasn't a villain. She was someone who had arrived somewhere without understanding its history and had made decisions as though history didn't matter. As though a clean-looking title and a fresh set of bylaws could overwrite 65 years of a family working land. That's a mistake a lot of people make. Some of them make it in offices. Some of them make it in subdivisions. Most of them, eventually, find out the same way Brenda found out, that the land remembers longer than any of us live. My grandfather understood something that took me years to fully appreciate. That land isn't just property, it's accumulation. Every deed, every handshake, every gravel road packed down by hand across a generation is a layer in something larger than any one person's ownership. You can hold land, but you cannot erase what it remembers. You cannot buy your way out of its history with a laminated copy of your bylaws. The road stayed. Of course it stayed. It was never hers to take. That spring, I took my youngest daughter Maya with me on the first tractor run of the season. She was 9 years old and had her grandfather's habit of watching things carefully before she asked questions about them. We drove the gravel road at dawn, the engine rumbling low, the fields just beginning to green up on both sides, the air still cold enough to see our breath. She sat beside me the way I used to sit beside my father, and the way my father used to sit beside his, half asleep, watching the world go past, learning without knowing she was learning. After a while, she looked at me. "Whose road is this?" she asked. I thought about that for a second. I thought about Walter Pruitt's pencil note in the margin, about Robert Henderson's careful signature, about Agnes finding a document in 11 minutes that had been sitting in a filing cabinet for 63 years, waiting for someone to need it. "Ours," I said. "It's always been ours." She nodded like that made sense. Then she turned back to the window and watched the fields go by, and I kept driving. Down the road my grandfather built, through the land my family has worked for over a century, toward the barn at the far end where the work was waiting, the way it always is, the way it always will be.